We're very fortunate to have Dr. Ruth Hayhoe join us again. And of course, Ruth, your own degree was in comparative education in London. Tell us a little bit about how comparative education was framed when you were in university.
Yeah, I studied at the University of London Institute of Education, did my PhD there, and that was back in the 1980s. I completed it in 1984. And I would say comparative education was one of the leading fields in the school, and it was very much interdisciplinary, but sociology was probably the core discipline. So I would see it as a kind of macro sociology of education. We had people like Basil Bernstein, very famous names who were on the curriculum there. But my own professor, Brian Holmes, labeled himself as a comparative education scholar. And so we were kind of looking at the core literature in comparative ed at that time.
And Brian Holmes is someone the students have read today. It is a complex reading, but we do, even in the last few years, we've had PhD students who have used this framework to pursue their own research. I'm thinking of Olivier, who looked at the 4 Nordic countries and used Holmes' framework to begin to sort out what the values and structures that developed their higher education system are and how that might be unique in the world. But when we look at today's readings, how do they begin to shape a field for us of comparative education that's a bit more distinct from comparative higher education?
Well, let me begin with the first reading, George Bereday. He was originally from Poland, actually, and he came over to Teachers College Columbia and was a key scholar there and really a famous name in the field of comparative education. And I think his reading is a very early anticipation of a very key theme in comparative higher, which is the move to mass higher education. You know, from universities being very elite and restrictive for a small percentage of the population to universities for all. And he actually called his book that, Universities for All, back in the 1970s. And I think his approach kind of reflected a broad and common approach. We might call it the inductive approach. You observe all the facts, you collect them, you organize them very systematically, you look at the context of different countries. And Bereday was amazing because he had many languages. So he had French, Polish, Russian, English, you know. And I think, you know, mastery of languages is pretty important for the field if you want to understand it seriously. So his book, Universities for All, was anticipating and predicting a movement to mass higher education. He looked around the world and using statistics from the OECD, found which are the countries that you could already define as having mass higher education, which was something like 15%. Martin Trowell basically refined this later. About 15% of the age cohort managing to go to universities. And that was very advanced in the 1970s. He found 4 countries. It's kind of interesting. The first was US. Canada was very early. Then Japan and the Soviet Union. So quite striking that they are from different regions of the world. Europe was somewhat behind. Continental Europe was still very elitist in terms of entry to higher education. So he kind of mapped that, and his chapter that you have as a reading, as the first of the 3 readings, kind of shows his approach. You collect the facts, you organize, you sort them out, and then you make certain conclusions. And he made some interesting conclusions. Everyone was predicting, oh my goodness, you know, the standards are going to go way down when you've got mass students in higher. How can you keep, you know, the high standards of university? But he didn't think so. He thought, no, standards can be maintained, and we can bring everybody up. The other concern people had, where are they going to find jobs, all these new university graduates? He wasn't too worried about that. He figured, you know, economies will open up, the need for higher educated people will open up, and so on. So his is a very classic approach, what we might call inductive method, based on very careful observation, the use of statistics, and then, you know, analysis from there. And the fact that Japan and the Soviet Union were in the same position as US and Canada is kind of an interesting point. You immediately have to think about why. You know, the Soviet Union actually was very advanced in education, even though, of course, it stumbled in other areas and collapsed in 1991. So that, I think his work is really worthwhile looking at as an early piece. I remember he was I heard him lecture once, and there's an award in the CIS Society has a George Bereday Award recognizing, I think it's maybe the best article or the best speech, something. You can look it up on their website. So that's Bereday. And then if you want me to go on to Holmes, or do you want to raise a question related to that? Holmes was so different.
I did have a question related to Bereday. When
Hmm.
he was comparing, I mean, he used statistics to do his work, but I've often heard students say, but how can you compare a country like the USSR to a country like Japan? They're just so different. And how did Bereday tackle those sorts of challenges, which are very central to comparative education?
Well, I think he was really strong on case studies also. So you have to look at the context of each country, and you have to look at how their culture, their political system, their economic system, because here we're talking about a Japan, capitalist Japan, socialist Soviet Union, and how those played into the policies that led to, as I say, in this case, the mass higher education. But one of his concerns was, this was a lot of anti-Soviet feeling at the time, that was Cold War times, right? That he wanted the Western world to have a more fair judgment, even though I think well, no, maybe he hadn't escaped from the Soviet Union. Hans, the other great comparative scholar, actually left the Soviet Union at the time of the revolution, but remained very balanced to say we really have to look at it in a systematic way, not in a purely political reaction to it. So I think Bereday would, again, you can look carefully. He talks about the steps of his method, in the piece that I gave you to read. And you can see that, yes, he's looking for broad trends, but he's also very aware. And I think context is one of the key things in comparative ed. How do you elaborate and understand the context? I find every thesis I've supervised, over 30 of them, the context chapter is the hardest one to write because
Absolutely.
you can't cover everything, but you have to pull out from the political and economic system, from the cultural tradition, from the religious system, what are the factors that then play into educational policy and the developments of education.
And Brian Holmes, who we've already mentioned once, he is a second reading. And of course, he has a very distinct way of doing this, quite complex. But how did you find that? Did you use that in your own work?
Yeah, I used Holmes a lot, and I still feel till now I'm grateful that I had the good fortune to be his doctoral student. So Holmes called his approach the problem approach. So rather than just observing all the facts, collecting them, and then analyzing the results, Holmes felt it's very important to define what is the problem. And then he defined the problem in terms of change and no change. So certain things changing very suddenly, and certain things not changing. And out of that comes a problem. So when you look at his Universities Inside, very old piece, but what he saw was, this is the 1960s and early 70s, student movements, huge demands on the parts of students for progressive developments and change. And yet nothing was very clearly defined, and there was no real agreement on what is the perfect society that we want to have. And then universities being really very slow to change, even slower than schools. Both their value patterns rooted in the medieval times and their institutional patterns were really rigid and had to change very, very slowly. So his whole point was, how do we find a way to bridge these changes? And he suggested different ways. One is, well, let the universities expand a small amount and then expand the whole second sector of higher education, vocational higher education, training, all those kind of things. So binary. And a lot of binary systems did emerge actually in the move to mass higher education. But I think what I liked particularly about Holmes, and that's why I had you read in the first week his chapter on ideal types, was that he gave a lot of importance to values. Mainly Western sociologies tried to be value neutral and try to see patterns of change and interpret them sociologically, but not giving enough attention to the values. And of course, the Marxist view is kind of value determining. So the economic factors determine how you reach a pure socialist state. But between the value neutral and the value determining, I think Holmes found an area which I defined as value explicit. So we need to identify and understand the values and bring them into our analysis of the problem, and then use them in our analysis. So Holmes then goes back to the great German sociologist, Max Weber. And I think I have one or two of his pieces on the reading because I think his insights were really profound. When he was trying to look at, I guess his famous piece is the Protestant ethic, capitalism and Protestant ethic in Europe. So Marx, he was very influenced by Marx's writing about economic change and capitalism and its consequences. But he said, there's a huge difference between Northern and Southern Europe. And how do you understand that difference? You have to look at values. And if you look at the values of the Protestant tradition, you'll see why a very different form of capitalism developed in Northern Europe than in Southern Europe. And then, of course, he developed what he called ideal types. And ideal types can be used to give a very clear definition to some core values, and also indeed to define core institutions. They're not intended to represent reality, but they're intended to be a kind of instrument of analysis. And for Holmes, he suggested you use an ideal type this way to look at the profound underlying values of a society that, say, shape their higher education systems or their schools. First of all, what is the idea of the human person? What is the idea of knowledge? And what is the idea of society? And you draw upon philosophical or religious texts to define those. You're not trying to represent reality, but you're trying to create a kind of exaggerated picture that you can then use as a tool to do comparative analysis. So the view of knowledge, if you take the European view, the Platonic view, it's very much based on mathematics. It's very logical. It's a kind of rational logic. But if you take the Confucian view, it's very much inductive. It's based on observation and gathering facts together and looking at it. If you take the American view, Dewey's view, knowledge comes through problem solving. So you can take these you can create a clear type of the view of knowledge in those three different contexts and then use it for comparative analysis. The same thing for the human person. Is the human person an individual with individual rights? That's very much our Western and particularly European view. In China, the human view is a social being. They only become a person when they're recognized by their family at 1 month old at a feast. So the whole notion of the human person and how they act and relate as a social being is different from as an individual being. And so I'm just trying to give some examples of those three core ideas. What about society? In the Confucian world, it's family writ large. So society is very much wrong. But in the Platonic world, you remember that the philosopher kings weren't allowed to have families because they might be selfish and private oriented. And so they had to use logic to create an ideal republic, which everyone had a right to be in. So you create these, and of course, you have to have good sources for them, and they can be challenged, but they help you to compare the core values of different societies. That helped me a lot between the Western view of the university and the Chinese view of higher education, and all the conflicts that arose much deeper than the political and economic context. We're rooted in these different values and views.
And I think when we look at ideal types, especially for people who are worried that they become stereotypes, that we say, well, everyone in this culture is this, has these features. That's actually not what we're doing. And a great example we had from one of our PhD students, Jackie, was a book about the 4 types of students you might encounter in universities. And this is a book for people working in student services, which I'm sure some of our students are. Yeah. And it gives us sort of some of the characteristics that might shape these students, some of the classic examples we find. And as Ruth often says, where there is a difference might be the most interesting point of analysis. So we might create an example of some of the structures and institutions that define certain countries or cultures, but where we begin to see a difference when we examine a new country is where the interest and the piece that we want to study actually comes up.
Yeah, that's where it's really interesting, because our tendency is to try and prove something. Mm-hmm. But actually, the best way to use an ideal type is disprove it. Why doesn't it fit? What are the pieces that don't fit this ideal type? So as you said, Jackie's example, you don't go around stereotyping people, but you use it as a kind of exploratory instrument. How much does it explain and what does it not explain? And that's, it works very well for the value systems. It also works for theories. So again, our tendency is to take a theory and let's try to find all the data we can to prove the theory. Then we got somewhere. But what I learned from Holmes was, no, take the theory and use it to test critically a particular phenomena that you want to understand. And what doesn't fit the theory becomes the most interesting. And I'll give you an example of that in the Asian context that I've also written about. In 1984, we had the World Congress in Paris. And we were trying to use dependency theory as a critical theory to look at China's experience of incursions from the West. So pretty well all the Western countries, whether we're talking France, Germany, USA, between 1911 and the 1950s, when China's revolution took place and they became a communist country, you know, they were all in there having an influence in education that was sometimes positive and sometimes not. And how far was it a matter of, you know, education being used to consolidate political and economic interests, which is really what dependency theory suggests. And I think the Latin American experience has a lot to give evidence of that kind of situation. And Freire's, you know, reaction to it is very powerful and became, you know, a very, very classic field in education. How does the local respond to the imposition of these political economic patterns, which are reinforced by educational patterns, which make it look normal when it's really not normal? It's a form of exploitation. So it seemed like it should work very well for China. But what was very fascinating was how much it didn't work. So the biggest imperialist power in China between 1911 and 40 were the British. They controlled the customs. They had gunboats going up and down the Yangtze River. They were a huge power. But guess what? They had almost no influence in education. There's no university in China that is built on a British model. The French had a lot of influence, but very little economic power. They had some cultural influence, right? The Germans were defeated in 2 world wars, and the Chinese thought, wow, their technical education is great. We're going to keep that, even though they're not very effective as a power, Western power. And they had created a university, a German university. Merkel was there for its 100th anniversary in 1911, which the French said, oh, well, when the Germans lost the war, we'll take it over. The Chinese said, no, we're going to make it a public university. It's such a good one. We need technical education. So it was really interesting to see that, you know, the theory really didn't work very well in the Chinese context, partly because the Chinese were very assertive about what would help them or what wouldn't help them, and partly because it was divided. There were different Western powers having different kinds of connections. But guess what? When the Soviets came in 1949, actually 1952, they told the Chinese, you've got to totally redo your higher education. Get rid of everything you got from the capitalist West. And we'll teach you how to create a really good macro planned higher education system that serves the whole country in a very systematic way. They went ahead and did that in 52. And guess what? In 58, the Chinese sent them all home. They said, this is Soviet social imperialism. And the reason was that the patterns, which were very logical and highly specialized, 400 kinds of engineering to build up a socialist country, just went totally against the Chinese epistemology and deep-rooted values. They just couldn't absorb them. They couldn't accept them. So it wasn't so much a political thing. Politically, they were both socialist, and you know, Soviet Union was a big brother to China, but it was a very deeply cultural and civilizational thing. And so then the Chinese, of course, had the tragedy of their Cultural Revolution. I still feel that partly came out of those cultural conflicts, not just the inter-party political conflicts and the conflict with the Soviet Union at times. So again, you know, it helps you to see those deep roots and see how they are manifested. And you take a theory, it's a very useful theory. I encourage students to use it, but don't try to prove it. Try to disprove it. And when you disprove it, then you find you get new insights and new understandings.
Absolutely. So one of the things that this particular reading always makes me wonder, especially when we talk about the Chinese case and how they interacted with the colonial powers, because you have a great piece, the Lessons from the Chinese Academy, which I think really helps to explain this. Wasn't China, I guess my question would be, isn't China just big enough? So what about a smaller country? I guess I'm wondering, can colonialism just wipe out those cultures and values that are underlying, or do they always sort of begin to come up? I've heard you use the term sort of, it cloaks it, but it's really underneath, or it's layered over top. Do we always see these cultural things sort of come up? Because colonial theory has been a very important sort of new theoretical framework in the university over the last 30 years, and is something we often come across, trying to understand these power dynamics.
Yeah, let me start with the first point, because I think the other great scholar in comparative higher ed, who started in comparative ed, actually, Philip Altbach, And he's your third reading in this session, right? Gigantic Peripheries. And there's a good example of a kind of dependency theory analysis. So he's taking India and China. Actually, he did that paper. I invited him to the conference. And he did that paper for our conference. And basically what he was convinced of, even in 2001, when he did the updated version of the paper, was that China and India, because of their disadvantage in the so-called periphery of dependency theory, no matter how well they developed, they had ancient scientific traditions and so on, it was still going to be very difficult for them to catch up because the scientific centers of the West still dominated. And it's good for you now to debate, how predictive was that or not, because we've certainly seen the rise of both India and China, since the 2001 when that article was published. But that's a kind of classic example. And I have to give credit to Phil. I think he was one of the early people who tried to move out of the Western-centric sociological approach to comparative higher ed of people like Burton Clark and so on, and say we have to look at the developing world and try to understand, can universities help them move from the periphery to the center? And what are the ways in which they can? And he made some quite positive suggestions of how they should do that. And as you're saying, for countries like India and China that have a huge mass, enormous educated population now, and rich historical and cultural resources, it's more possible. Whereas smaller African countries in Southeast Asia, where the colonial power was very solidified and the languages have already begun to disappear, the traditional languages and English and French have become the languages of discourse, can they change? And here I want to point to one of the scholars I admired most, whose work helped me a lot, and that's Ali Mazrui. And he was a Kenyan who grew up actually he was at the University of Makerere in Uganda, which was a very famous university back in his time. I think he did his PhD in either Cambridge or Oxford, and was a wonderful writer and so on, and ended up in his later years spending half the year in Binghamton, New York, where there was a global cultural center. I got him to come to Toronto. I was very proud of that. I also brought him to China in the 1990s. And then half the year I forget, I think it's Nigeria. He taught at one of the universities in Nigeria. And I think his whole idea of mutuality and of encouraging African universities to support their own languages. He used the word domestication. First of all, you have to value your own history. And he did a lot on African, big series for the BBC, wonderful writing. He was a political scientist, actually, not a comparative scholar, but his work is very comparative. So domestication was number one. The second was diversification. For the African countries, don't just look to your former colonial leaders, like the British, the French, or whatever. Look to other sources. Look to the Middle East. Look to China. Look to India to diversify the influences as you develop your universities. And then, of course, his third word was counterpenetration. Bring the riches. And we know for African countries, some areas there are just fabulous. Jazz music, some of the arts, other rich areas. How do you bring those to Western universities? And our own Karen Mundy did a lot of work in Africa. And I remember she had one or two events at OISE, just highlighting some of the richness of African traditions in higher learning and in the arts and so on. So I think Mazrui's formula, domestication, diversification, counterpenetration, those three pieces, as a way to respond to colonialism, patterns of dependency that are imposed and not. And I think the whole problem with dependency theory is it didn't really respect the initiatives and strengths of diverse local cultures. And I think what we've seen in the last 20 years is that they can be very effective, and we've seen that, yeah.
And I think that's why that Altbach piece, for those of us who might only have a lens post the year 2000, that Altbach piece reminds us that if he was seeing China and India, these huge powers now, as peripheries, what other regions of the world right now may be on a trajectory to emerge when people consider them peripheries and unimportant. We were working on a piece last year with Jane Knight on the Pan-African University and some of the incredible environmental and technology research centers that are being started in collaboration as a region. This idea of regionalism and how we begin to, and of course, in the midst of it, the cultural distinctiveness of Africa is very much written into the documents of this university to begin to have a continental sense of identity that they develop.
Yeah, I think that's been so important in regions that they work together rather than as independent countries, because the whole idea of the nation state is really a very European idea. And in Africa, it's so clear that it got imposed in ways that often created conflict, divided tribal groups with common languages and so on. So it's been quite problematic. And so regional cooperation in supporting the development of regional institutions, and I think Africa is a wonderful example of that. So, yeah.
Well, Ruth, I'm so thankful that you've come to talk to us today about this. There are some pieces for our students. The piece on ideal types is in your supplementary material section of this module on the website.
Yeah.
And we also want to welcome Ruth back. We'll have her back for our section on East Asia as well. When you are beginning to think about your final papers, this session might be something you watch again to begin to think of how you sort out those categories and features of a civilization or a culture or a region, to begin to understand what are the deeply held values that then shape higher education in that context. So Ruth, thank you so much for coming.